Yes, indeed. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Jonathan Wolff, who is a professor now at Oxford University. Previously was at University College London, and he was part of a cohort, I think, of excellent British political philosophers and political theorists in the 80s and 90s. Published books that I can really recall and find have been influential. Book on Nozick and also another one on Marx, which kind of tried to argue what was left after the collapse of communism. And so it's a very interesting, reflective work. Um, More recently, Jonathan's, you've got an introduction to political philosophy as well, which is that translated into Chinese? Well, we must work
Yes.
on that. Good. So it's readily available for Chinese students. So there's an excellent record of very interesting publications. And one of the things I do recall about Jonathan is that he had a column in The Guardian, which I'm not sure was weekly, but certainly was run quite systematically for very many years, touching usually on educational matters, but also more widely, which I've enjoyed reading very much. So you can start that up again, Jonathan. Good.
Yeah.
So with that introduction, I'd like him continue with his talk, which is on nationalisms in a whole variety of different guises. Perhaps you repeat the title, so I privilege, is it a privilege, and also protection?
Purification, pride,
Yeah.
privilege, and protection.
There we are, which all sounds, I can't think of a more relevant topic for our present times. Thank you very much, Jonathan. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Howard and Demin, for the invitation. It's a slightly nostalgic experience for me, having just said hello to Alyssa for the first time for possibly 35 years or longer than that. And shortly after, Howard invited me to a conference in Wales, and we published, or Howard edited a volume, collected a volume from the conference that was published in Slovakian, I think. So it was, the works were translated. So I think that was probably my first translated article that was Howard's doing. It's very good to speak to this audience. I've been to China a few times. I haven't been since COVID. So this is a nice substitute for a visit, and I hope to visit again before too long. Now, the talk I'm going to give, and I'll probably talk for about 20 minutes, so we have half an hour of discussion. It's on an emerging project for me. When I went to Oxford a few years after I was there, I was given a new chair, Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy. And the Alfred Landecker Foundation was developed in Germany. Most of the work it does is around Holocaust memorialization. It's named after a man who died in the Holocaust, but they also endow my chair, and my chair is not about Holocaust studies, but minority protection. I hadn't really worked in that area, and I thought this was a good time really to be thinking about not just human rights, not just democracy, but about nationalism. Because I moved to the Blavatnik school just before Brexit, just before Trump, and the world changed considerably in the first year or so before I got there. And this talk is part of a bigger project that is inspired, again in a nostalgic mode, by a passage in the very first book I ever reviewed, which was of Brian Barry's collected papers. And he's got a paper in there that's not very well known called Self-Government Revisited, about the philosopher John Plamenats. And Barry just makes this remark in passing about nationalism, that his generation of political philosophers have treated nationalism as sort of contrary to civilized values, that if you're a civilized person, you're anti-nationalism. And he says the reason for that, or part of the reason, is that the scholarly endeavor of political theory, like many other academic areas, was really created by people who were refugees from Nazi Germany and Austria. And so if you think about the giants of the field in political theory, many of them are people who fled from nationalism. Hannah Arendt is most obvious name, but people like Hirschman, Judith Sklar is another. Leo Strauss, very different type. The Frankfurt School, the New School. So very many of the people who created the discipline of political thought in North America, to a lesser extent in Europe, are people whose families suffered, many died at the hands of nationalism. So no wonder they're opposed to nationalism. And I think in all my studying of political philosophy, in my years as a undergraduate and graduate student, I didn't really come across nationalism taken seriously. If we had a view about it, we would say national borders are, morally speaking, an irrelevance, and that we should be universalists or cosmopolitans of some sort. But that view of dismissing nationalism has really come back to bite us in the last decade or so, that nationalism has been on the rise, and many people who are philosophically very sympathetic to a more cosmopolitan view, except that it's psychologically unrealistic to think that human beings can identify with the broad community of all human beings. And so my teacher, Jerry Cohen, when he was rethinking Marxism, he has papers reconsidering historical materialism. And one thing he says is that it seems to be, like it or not, human beings have a need to identify with a group that is less than the whole of all human beings. So we need to, he thinks, have some form of group identification, and national identification has been the major part of that. So cosmopolitanism is psychologically unrealistic. It goes against the rise of nationalism. And it also, I found more recently, has sometimes been used, cosmopolitanism, in a type of imperialist way as well. Reading in some works about the history of the Soviet Union, one of the claims at certain points was that if national borders have no intrinsic importance, no moral importance, then why shouldn't smaller countries be incorporated in larger ones for purposes of administrative efficiency and ideological purity, perhaps? So cosmopolitanism, as an active philosophical idea, will have very little political traction, and we haven't seen it have much traction. We've also seen a return of nationalism, and this has happened within political philosophy. So there are books by my colleague, David Miller, Yael Tamir in Israel, who have written in defense of liberal nationalism. A small number have followed, not maybe as many as they hoped. They both wrote books, I think, in the 90s around liberal nationalism. They've both written a book again in the last few years trying to explain the attractions of nationalism, which I will get back to. But more worryingly, we also, for a brief time, I think it's faded now, but immediately post-Brexit, there were people in the UK on the left who said, we've missed something by not being nationalist. We've allowed the right to colonize the idea of nationalism, to put it that way. And so nationalism has become appropriated by people who are using it for very exclusive and unpleasant purposes. What we need to do is try to get a type of fusion between progressive politics and nationalist politics. And I think the thought was that as long as we're left-wing and progressive and pro-poor, if we add nationalism, everything will be okay. Now, I found this very alarming because at that same time, I was reading about the rise of fascism. And in Italy, that is more or less what Mussolini did. So Mussolini had been part of a far left group. He was very dissatisfied with the left's pacifism in the First World War. And so he thought he could graft nationalism onto a left-wing view. He was in favor of votes for women, in favor of reducing the working day, in favor of a lot of policies that the British left would have associated with. And similarly, in the early declarations of the Nazi Party in Germany, you see things that are almost indistinguishable from the Communist Party, unless you look very closely at the small print. I was astonished to read in Samuel Moyn's book about the origin of the Gini coefficient. So many of you will know that the Gini coefficient is used for measuring inequality, income inequality in a country. Samuel Moyn said it's no surprise that the Gini coefficient was developed by a fascist called Gini. Now, I must say I'd never heard of Gini. I didn't know why the Gini coefficient was called the Gini coefficient, but it was devised by an Italian economist who was also a fascist. How do we know he was a fascist? Well, he wrote books with titles like In Defense of Fascism. And so he was as naked a fascist as you could get in the Italian context, yet we use his methods for measuring inequality. Why were the fascists interested in inequality? Well, because in early stages, they were part of the workers' movement as well. So the workers' movement, or the fascist movement, was in its initial stages a workers' movement. So this made me very nervous, and I wanted to resist the placing together of progressive thought and nationalist thought because of the direction it could lead. At the same time, many of my students, so I teach at the Blavatnik School of Government, we have students from 50 countries. Once upon a time, in a lecture, I asked people to put up their hands if they were living in a country that had suffered colonial domination. And virtually every hand in the class went up. It was only those people in Western Europe who didn't put their hands up. So every country pretty much on earth has suffered at the hands of colonial power. And they've used nationalism as a way of resisting colonialism, at least in many cases. So this sets a type of conundrum. If on the one hand, nationalism is evil, leads to fascism or can do, on the other hand, it is a good thing because it can lead to national independence. What does one think about this? And in fact, one of my colleagues posed this conundrum to my students. Said, how can you be opposed to national borders in rich countries but want to assert them in poor countries? And this caused a sort of panic among the students because they didn't know how to reply to it, and almost caused a crisis in the school of people having to be forced at such a brute level to consider their own ideological views or political views. So puzzling over this, I came to the view that nationalism isn't one thing. And there are many people who want to make distinctions between forms of nationalism. So it's very common now for people to try to distinguish nationalism from patriotism, or inclusive nationalism from exclusive nationalism. It's all about trying to find good nationalism as distinguished from bad nationalism. I'm sympathetic to that program, but I think we just need to dig a bit deeper. And so what I propose, and I'm sure many others have done similar things, but what I propose is we think about nationalism in terms of its function, and that nationalism can have different functions. And this explains the title of my paper, or a functional analysis, and also a love for alliteration is another thing that explains the title of my paper, because the paper is called Nationalisms, Purification, Pride, Privilege, and Protection. So the 4 Ps: purification, pride, privilege, and protection. And the basic thought is that different nationalisms have highlighted these to different strengths. So I wouldn't want to say that you can assign each nationalism to one of these categories. Rather, what I would say is that there are these 4 aspects of nationalism, and they will all have them in varying degrees. The mix of the features will go a long way to explaining whether it is a morally legitimate form of nationalism or a morally questionable form. So let's take the first one, purification. So purification at its worst is an attempt to have within one territory people of just one type, one nationality. Normally that would go with speaking one language, being one religion, one ethnicity. And purification can take many forms. So the most extreme form would be extermination of those who don't fall into the right category. Expulsion is probably more common. Discouragement, encouraging emigration, reducing rights, having first-class and second-class citizens, and so on. So purification is an attempt to have this idea of national purity. And you can probably tell from the tone of my voice and general attitude that this is something that is a negative, highly negative feature, maybe the worst feature of nationalism. Now, and that, of course, is what I associated nationalism with for a long time. But in more recent years, when I've been reading works like David Miller and even more so Yuval Tamir, they want to argue for a type of liberal nationalism, which preserves everyone's human rights, and so would be against purification, at least in the sense in which I've discussed it. And I found myself with very mixed feelings reading, say, Yuval Tamir's recent book, Why Nationalism? Because on the one hand, I was very strongly opposed to nationalism. On the other hand, you go through chapter by chapter, and she talks about the pride that countries sometimes have in their cuisine, not my country, but maybe your country, pride in sporting prowess. She comes from Israel. She talks about the time when an Israeli woman won Miss Universe, maybe not an example we would pick on now, but the national pride in Israel to have that, the time they beat, I can't remember whether it was Russia or the United States in a basketball game. You know, this was great national celebration. And I absolutely see that. There are things that, you know, I support England when we play football and when we play cricket. I want them to win. I take pride in that. So this idea that there are valuable attributes of your country in which you can take pride, that seems to me to be the acceptable face of nationalism. And I'll come back to that just at the end. The third category I have is privilege. Now, what I mean by this is that if you take a country like mine at the moment, the United Kingdom, and the Tory party has, whether it's created or exploited, a type of great opposition to immigration. And of course, that led to Brexit. Part of the result of Brexit is, for whatever reason, we now have net immigration at the highest rate we've ever had, I think. So that didn't work. And so there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric at the moment. But what is that based on? Well, some of it might be based on this purification. We only want one type of person around here. Many of the immigrants are the same type of person. They're not have the same religion and so on. What it is, I think, people are worried, and whether this worry is well-founded or not isn't my question. But what people want, what they're worried about is if immigration rises, then wages will fall, hospitals will become more crowded, they'll be further back in the waiting list for council houses and so on. That is, they have a certain standard of living that they have taken for granted, and they feel that's under threat from immigration. They want to preserve national boundaries in order to preserve what they have. But of course, what they have may well be much more than anything the immigrants have at the moment. So from a point of view of egalitarianism, that would be unacceptable. Very often, the privilege a country has is based on its past colonial heritage. I'm sure that is true of my country. And so we've got a type of unjust privilege that we're trying to hang on to. And so this is what I mean by privilege. We've got ourselves in an advantaged position in the world. We citizens are enjoying a high living standard. We don't want to share that with other people, and we don't want to risk losing it. So again, that would be one of the less justified reasons. It's interesting that in the newspapers, If you can show that hospital waiting lists will rise if we have more immigrants, that is taken to be a sort of irrefutable argument against immigration. But it does presuppose that these current levels are justified and the current inequalities are justified, which is another question. Finally, my fourth category, so protection. So here I'm interested in a number of forms of protection. One is economic protection. So one thing that developing countries need to do is grow their economies. Sometimes what they need to do is to restrict imports to protect their own industries. This is bad for the country as consumers in the short term, but good for them as producers and possibly better for them as consumers in the longer term. So this is a type of resistance of globalization. And I think that can be justified. In the Welsh context, the protection probably is not so much about the economy, but about a type of political autonomy. So I think there is a case that nationalism, in order to get a type of autonomy, to be a sense of control of your own fate, can be justified. There are going to be different cases. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it will work less well. I don't have anything good to say about that, so I'd be interested in comments. Finally, something David Miller has emphasized is protection of national culture. Now, I find this a much more difficult argument because on some levels, it can look like a type of purification argument that we want to keep things pure, we don't want change. And it goes back to arguments around liberalism, for example, and the debate between H.L.A. Hart and Devlin, where Devlin argued that liberalism would lead to a type of corruption, and Hart in reply said he's confusing change and corruption. Things develop, things alter. There's a type of progression that is welcome. So I would not want to argue strongly in favor of defending a national culture. I think any national culture is a hybrid of many influences. The most popular meal, supposedly in, I don't know about Wales, but in England is curry. And I was talking only yesterday about how the great transformation in English cuisine, as far as I was concerned, was the introduction of the kebab shop. And we then understood that food could have a taste, which we didn't really know about before that. So national cultures develop in many ways. Now, the longer project I'm involved in is trying to think not just about nationalism, but alternatives to nationalism. Because if we accept that people do need to identify with groups that are smaller than humanity, do they have to be national groups? So I'm very interested in the ways in which group identity and also pride in that group identity can be part of a smaller group or a transnational group. So religions, for example, attract loyalty and pride, but they are typically cross-national. Language groupings is another, maybe that goes closer to nationalism, and I don't want to fasten all my hopes on religion. But if you think of anyone's identity, there's a famous quote from Alistair MacIntyre in his book After Virtue, which was taken as one of the founding passages of communitarianism, where he says, I'm someone's son, I'm someone's father, I'm a member of this group, this association, this nation. And he lists about 20 identities that someone has. Only one of those identities is their nation. And the others are things like their profession, societies, friendship groups, family groups. So I'm very interested in the ways in which these other groupings can meet many of the needs of nationalism without leading to the vicious and violent forms of nationalism that we've seen around before. So I think I will stop there and very interested in any comments. I'm just as interested in comments as I am in questions, so I can give you that permission. beforehand. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Wolff. So the floor is open for questions and discussion. So if anyone have a question, just raise your hand and or speak up. Okay, Alisa, you have a question? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, I can't see the raise hand function just now, so I just
Yeah.
waved. How many of the most prominent writers in favor of nationalism have been female? The reason I ask is because many of the distinctive cultures have had long traditions of patriarchy. Now, I'm not by profession a feminist. I don't write about feminism. And it's not generally my hobby horse. It's not generally the angle I introduce. But I was just thinking about reasons why people, I think often advocacy of nationalism of a particular, one's particular nation is a form of resistance to one or another influence, or in particular group or set of influences that one doesn't like, doesn't want. So it's a resistance to change often. And I'm just thinking about who wants to keep things the way that they are, and how often it's the people who are privileged or dominating who are most happy with preserving the traditional form, the traditional culture, or whatever they whatever prevails. And so I know Yael Tamir is one of the prominent writers. I talked with her when she was at Harvard, and I spent 3 years in Israel myself in my early 20s. I think Israel is rather a special case because of the history of the Jewish people. And my father was Jewish, and just by the way, he was one of the founding members of the Palestine Philharmonic Orchestra, which became the Israel Philharmonic. He was one of the first concertmasters. And so there are very powerful reasons with which I have some personal familiarity for being nationalist, even if you're female. And we know that many females are strongly religious, and when nationalism goes together with that religion, that can be combined. But I think for many other women, nationalism can be questionable. So in Israel, I encountered a lot of Orthodox women, Jewish women, including many American immigrants. And I found myself feeling quite alienated from them. In fact, most of my experience in Israel was finding myself surprised at how alien I felt from so many of the people I met. I felt most, I could communicate best with the Israeli left, the Shalom Achshav movement. And so anyway, I just think considering how many women have been advocates of nationalism and exactly what they've said could be an interesting angle for research.
So it is interesting. So as you were saying, thinking of the contemporary writers, I only know really two major philosophers who have spent a lot of time. And of course, one is Yael Tamir, the other is David Miller, I mentioned. If you go back the decades, of course, there was a lot of discussion in New York, particularly around the foundation of the State of Israel, and but that was a special case. I think the discussion has been in the type of analytic political philosophy, political thought I've been doing. There just haven't been people writing about it very much in the last decades. I'm sure there are many people. There also haven't been that many, as you know, female political philosophers from the sort of 70s and 80s, and they had other things to concern themselves with. But I'll look into this. I mean, people like Sklar, Pitkin, Hannah Arendt, none of them are known as nationalists, but at the same time, I'm not sure any of them were known for writing about nationalism. Maybe Arendt did somewhere. So thank you. Yeah, I'll think more. I mean, you've got a reply.
Just one quick follow-up. I am an admirer of Pauline Kleingeld's work.
Okay. Mm.
She's the Kant scholar,
Mm.
and she has written about constitutional patriotism.
Okay.
So if you want to broaden your conception of nationalism, or if you want to compare contrast, that would be worth it would be worth reading her article on constitutional patriotism. So Kleingeld.
Good. I
Thanks.
know her work on Kant and racism, but I haven't seen this. Thank you.
Howard, you have a question? You are muted. You are muted.
That might have been to everyone's advantage. That was thanks for a very wide-ranging talk, and I think you've covered a lot of ground and brought up all the areas where the disputes are pressing at the moment. So thanks for that. I think I agree with you that there's this reason to kind of have a mooted support for nationalism, where it helps people to come together, you know, where it provides focus and allows for a sense of belonging, and you can get a community spirit going, because any large-scale social organization, and you know, now we live in under states, perhaps the whole of humanity. Any large-scale or social organization leads to gains and losses, and some people are mostly on the losses side, and for them to be able to identify with the whole, which maybe is getting a little bit better, and there's something coming out of it for them, that's a good thing. You know, you need people to be able to stick with their communities, you know, over time. That kind of social solidarity is essential for any kind of social and civil society. So I agree there. I think, though, that one of the, if you reflect on why these senses of social belonging are important, I think a lot of it has to do with having to live under a legal system, you know, where people accept rules and don't try to exempt themselves and militate against them. So it's difficult to bring that legal side of it, the sense of there being a need for people to obey in a society, even where things aren't quite going their way. I don't think you can easily get that from nationalism on its own. You need some other ingredient. And I think Alyssa has pointed to one area where that might be possible, and that's through the idea of constitutional patriotism, which Habermas developed in probably one of the most fraught societies in terms of discussing nationalism. You're saying how, in a sense, Israel is an exception. Well, also not Germany is pretty exceptional with this, because they've gone right through the whole gamut of possible nationalist standpoints, and they've got to think about, well, what holds them together and how should it be done. And his idea, I think, is quite fruitful, where you see yourself as part of a common organization, common lifestyle, common culture, but the culture focuses as well on arrangements that sustain a society over time. And nowadays, of course, you need one that not only sustains individual states over time, but sustains the kind of arrangements we've now made for sustaining and allowing prosperity amongst states. So you need, in addition to the local national identity, you need some kind of way of generating not necessarily cosmopolitanism, but at least a sense of regional belonging, and that ultimately might lead to a practical cosmopolitanism where people see that the whole thing has got to hang together. So that, I think that's the challenge. I mean, the difficulty with constitutional patriotism is that it's that much harder to identify with. It involves a kind of metaphysical commitment, which you can't just put down to flags and a sense of emotion, you know, you've got to see why it's necessary and to embrace it in that way. So I think that's the kind of direction that I might go in. I think but you seem to me that you would be sympathetic to it, but it needs a lot of thinking out, doesn't it?
So so I thought you were going to take us one step further to Kant here. I thought all paths lead to Kant. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if you like, I can give you that bit as well. I was a bit upset that you were not upset, a bit disappointed. You said you thought that cosmopolitanism was slightly off the agenda. I think that there is a way of combining cosmopolitanism. Well, for cosmopolitanism to work, you need the individual states to work. You need to have them working together. So that would be the argument. Thank you for taking me one step further.
So I think so. As you said, it was a wide-ranging talk, so therefore I was very superficial on many things, including cosmopolitanism and the many forms of cosmopolitanism. And a type of federal cosmopolitanism may well be where we need to be heading. So what I worry about, even with something like constitutional patriotism, is whether it is always on the verge of developing into something else. And so if you think about India, for example, so for a long time, India was thought to be a type of inclusive form of nationalism, and then suddenly it's turned into an exclusive type. So it's you need to be concerned about the sort of underlying dispositions and dangers as well as what you've got on the surface. But at the same time, I don't believe anything is ever stable, and everything runs on goodwill in the end. So you need the types of systems that people can sign up to, and perhaps this is the way to go. I mean, it is interesting as you were describing Habermas. I thought actually this is also a view that people were developing in the context of the sort of liberal communitarian debate, in more in North America, I think, than in Europe. But this idea that we need a form of community, but we can't have it based on any particular characteristics other than something like the need for community itself. So people were developing ideas of civic virtue rather than thicker notions of virtue. Maybe that's also something to look at. But I'm less interested in. I mean, practically, I'm very interested in recovering type of liberal nations at work, whatever that requires. But I'm also very interested in sources of value that group value that we've neglected. So just to add just a little bit more on this part of the project I'm involved in is thinking about, how do we know what's valuable? So how do we know what are the other sources of value? And one hypothesis is that what people are prepared to spend their time and money on the things that they value. And if you think about the sociology and anthropology of ordinary life, we spend a huge amount of our time and money on ceremonies and rituals like marriage ceremonies and funerals, christenings, graduation ceremonies. But in the Western tradition, we don't seem to have a philosopher of ceremony. We don't have anyone who has really spent a lot of time thinking about those things. So part of my next project is to be thinking about the value of ceremony, at least in this sort of epistemological way, of showing the things we value. And your family, of course, and community, nation too, but family and community are things we spend a lot of our attention and resources on. So I want to try to bring these ideas back into certainly moral philosophy and ideally political philosophy as well. So these other groups other than nations, and how do we know what they are and how do we access them? So thank you, Howard.
Can I just a bit? I mean, I think that you could note as well in Rawls's idea of overlapping consensus. You've got this idea of some sort of social solidarity, and I think in that sense also you might be going in a direction in which Habermas seems to have done, which is in recent years he's tried to tap religious life as a base, as an area for commonality and working on that and dialogue. Thank you, Amy. Thanks for your answer.
I'm aware of Habermas's work, and there are 2 or 3 books of his on my desk that I need to look at in this new light. I mean, so Rawls has 2 ideas. One is the overlapping consensus. One I thought you were going to mention was what I think he talks about: a social union of social unions.
Yes,
well.
yeah, which he takes from Humboldt, doesn't he?
Yeah. So that would also be relevant. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to use my privilege as moderator to ask a question or offer a brief comment, if that's okay. You just mentioned ceremonies, and it reminds me of Confucianism actually, and I mentioned it in the book that I'm currently writing. So it's kind of a comparison between Tocqueville and some Eastern political thoughts. In Confucianism, there's a very important emphasis on rituals, what early Confucians call rituals. Important mission that early Confucians think they are doing is to bring rituals to people's lives, bring rituals back to people's lives, to practice the right rituals. And in my interpretation, it's really a kind of important measure for the society, because it reminds people of your place in a community, and also it maintains a sense of belonging and also values that circulate in the community, and it also helps to restrain power in this sense. Well, it's just a kind of a side note. And also in my, I'm writing about Tocqueville, but Tocqueville does not really defend nationalism per se in my interpretation, but he's definitely in favor of a sense of community. So his political thinking is really based on the value of local, self-government and in the community and so on. And on one occasion, only on one occasion, he elevates this kind of defense of community to the national level, in the sense that he defended, France's right to intervene in this international competition in Europe at that time, with regard to overseas expansion and empire building. He thinks that this is what France should do, because if France does not do that, it will be reduced to a second-ranked country in the competition in Europe. In this case, I think nationalism maybe played a role in his thinking, because it used as argument for independence, for freedom of the nation, and also because you mentioned colonialism in defense of nationalism. I think it's also a relevant argument. I think I read David Miller and others some time ago. In my feeling, I think it's really difficult to defend nationalism per se, but it's okay, I think, to say that there are positive, traits of nationalism. I think I'm very sympathetic to this kind of argument, but it seems to me that it depends on what kind of a context you are talking about. If you are saying that nationalism helps, people to unite together and defend their independence, defend their collective freedom, for instance, against a kind of imperialistic power. I think it's really defensible in this case. But on the other hand, even for colonized peoples, nationalism can be a bad thing because it always works to eliminate some diversity, in a community, and tries to impose a kind of a uniform value or uniform culture or uniform rule over a naturally diversified people. And I think this happens everywhere. So I think it depends on in what context you are talking about, and to what specific problems that we are addressing. It's as many people may say, nationalism is a double-edged sword. It can cut both ways. That's my brief comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we agree with a lot, and that was very well put. So always seeking a common identity, I think, it is a problem, and that for me goes under the heading of purification. Just a very quick comment on Confucius. So thank you for raising it. In fact, it won't be any surprise, it was Confucius that got me started thinking about ritual and ceremony. Because when I was writing my introduction to moral philosophy and the readings in moral philosophy, I wanted to include some Confucius, and I read Confucius properly for the first time and thought, well, what is the difference between Confucius and Aristotle? Because they're both very wise people giving us advice about how to live our lives. And obviously there are many, many differences, but the one that that really struck me was how notions of ritual and ceremony, and also family and tradition, played a role in Confucius that I didn't see in Aristotle in the same way. That's got me thinking, who are the philosophers of ceremony in the Western tradition as opposed to the Eastern tradition? Whenever I found anyone, immediately they were talking about Confucius again, unless it was Spinoza who was saying that ceremonies are superstitious and we need to get rid of them. So you have this sort of anti-religious approach to ceremonies you see in Hume and Spinoza of superstition, and it's only, I think, in the Chinese tradition that we see the positive value being emphasized. So this is something that is very curious, and I need to work more on. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions, a couple of hands raised. I'm not sure who raised first at this moment. So, Andrew? Yeah, or Sylvia? I don't know. So Andrew, if you want.
Andrew.
Okay.
All right. Okay, thanks for that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's a big topic, and there's obviously a few questions came into my head when you were talking. I suppose take up Howard's point earlier that when you said that there's little traction for cosmopolitanism, it just struck me as there's a kind of real complex terminological mix of terms here, which, for example, universalism, internationalism, which often interblend with each other. So you could talk of international human rights or cosmopolitan human rights, and you're pretty much talking about the same kind of thing. And so in talking about that kind of complex mix, there are kind of political senses of cosmopolitanism, internationalism, legal senses, there are moral senses, there are even sociological senses. So the idea that, and if you think of that in terms of international law and the international courts and such like, then it seems a kind of weird thing to say that there's little traction for it. It's problematic, but most things do have that kind of problematic feel about them. The second point I just wanted to make is that one thing which makes nationalism, I think, problematic historically, morally, politically, philosophically, is its rather messy and often unexplained relationship with the state tradition. And often, you know, where the two become, as in the United Nations, the League of Nations, and such like, you have almost a kind of automatic kind of synonymity being cast up between them. The neglect of talking about the state in terms of the kind of etymology and history of the concept of nationalism probably is problematic. But I can see in that context why you would want to talk about kind of non-national groups, which I kind of have some kind of degree of sympathy with. But what I would tend to say that there is quite a large literature going back to the 19th century on different non-national groups. And all the kind of communitarian stuff we're familiar with from the 1980s probably has a range of precursors. You know, obviously the famous ones are people like Tönnies and Gierke and a whole host of, and Durkheim and such like. So there's a kind of an absolute deluge of different types of understandings of groups, which long precede the kind of debates about communitarianism in the 1980s. I think that's, one final thing. Sorry about this kind of great deluge of questions. One other problem for nationalism, which I think probably is worth thinking about, is the relationship between nationalism and multiculturalism. Because that has, if you think of that in recent years, in the last decade, people like Cameron and others saying, "Oh, the time of multiculturalism is over; it's dead," and stuff like that. There is, but it's not really dead in terms. Say in British society, there's many cultural groups in our society who are quite kind of, well, proud of their cooking or their culture, whatever you want to put. So that problematic relationship between multicultural as a type of group and nationalism as a type of group is something that's probably well worth thinking about. And I should say, finally, I'll end there. Sorry, I could go on talking, but I won't. The initial ceremony, I think the conservative tradition probably since the 19th century has often a concentrated, people like de Maistre, Cortés, the Spanish writer, you know, even someone like Burke in England in his kind of odd way. I'll think of Scruton going on about the Church of England and all the rest of it. You know, there is a lot of kind of attention to a ceremonial kind of perspective of a sort in conservative traditions of writing. Anyway, sorry, I bombarded you with too much there. Forgive me.
No, thank you. So many are on my reading list. I can't claim to have read all. People who mentioned Andrew Scruton. I have a certain fondness for Scruton. I know you're not meant to, but
get thee behind me.
Yeah, he was one of my teachers, and you know, he obviously a very provocative figure. I hadn't thought of looking at Burke actually on ceremony. I don't know that I don't know
Probably
exactly.
Not so obvious, but I mean, it's more the kind of the focus on institutions and their ceremonies and processes. And
yeah, so yeah, okay, I will look there. No, I think the points you make are very well taken, and I think when I was talking about cosmopolitanism, I was really thinking about a moral idea being translated into a political idea, and the failures of that for single world government, for example. But you're absolutely right about international law, particularly international, you know, the laws of war, humanitarian law. How much teeth they have is another matter. But we're at a level there now we've never seen before. So I think I do need to take that seriously. So thank you. I don't really have responses, but I made my notes. Thanks.
Could I just make a point about ritual as well? I think that Rousseau gives quite a bit of attention to the role of processions and you know, public ceremony in
Okay. So I'll have a look. I mean, I remember he talks about civil religion and also the importance of the censor, the public censor, who will maintain public morality. I don't recall passages about processions, but it doesn't surprise me. I'll go back to take a look. Thank you.
Okay, maybe Sylvia, you want to jump in?
Hello, Professor Wolff, it's a pleasure. I apologize, I was a bit late, so I think I probably missed 3 minutes from the introduction, but I followed the 3-piece or the 4-piece presentation with great interest. And I have 2 comments, and you don't need to respond to that. I'm not sure whether I make sense, because, you know, we have a problem of interpretation, always how I interpret the ideas of somebody else. I would say that you have 2 projects at the moment, not 1, but 2, and they're actually very different. And the reason why I think that that's very interesting is because one of these projects has to do with liberalism, with the philosophy of liberalism, but the other actually doesn't. At least how I interpret the problematic. So the first one, where you talk about purification, pride, privilege, and protection, where you basically you want to deconstruct, in a way, nationalism into these aspects. When you start with purification, this is basically the roots of proto-fascist doctrines and so on. That basically starts with historicism. So you don't need to start with liberalism at all. And actually your units of analysis, I mean, purification, yes, there you have the nation, but pride, the unit of analysis is culture, protection, the unit of analysis is the state, because it's the state, not the nation, which imposes protectionism and so on. So I would say that this is an interesting project, one type of project, but then I interpreted the second project, which I would be more interested as a political theorist. I'm a contractarian, by the way. I do a lot of work on Hobbes. And I was thinking about the explanandum, what do you want to explain, and the explanans, what factors you're bringing in to explain the explanandum. And the way because I'm like importing my own assumptions in a way, but the way I understood your explanandum, or the problem which you want to explain, is to say, look, here is liberal theory, and liberal theory makes this opposition between the individual and the state, but it doesn't really address the question of groups, which is in between the individual and the state. And that's where I want to problematize, if you want. There is a lacuna, in other words, in liberal theory, the group. And you talked about borders and identity and political community. So for me, that is the explanandum which you are trying to explain. And the explanans, the factors which you bring in to explain this problematic, would be then nationalism, fascism, liberalism. So that's how I would structure it. So I don't know whether that's a book project. I would say beyond liberalism, the need for community, because that's how I interpreted your project. Okay. You don't need to respond to any of those.
So it's a type of, it is an attempt at a type of communitarianism in a way. I know that's a dirty word now, but a type of multi-communitarianism rather than one nation, one community. So I think what you say is very insightful. There is a liberal strand, there's a non-liberal strand. I'm not sure I've seen yet that exactly I want to explain anything, but I will definitely think about that question. So thank you.
So why communitarianism is a dirty word now? So I'm sorry, I'm kind of ignorant about that.
Yeah. Well, so there was a big debate, wasn't there, in the 80s with Michael Sandel trying to spearhead a type of communitarian critique of Rawls and trying to draw McIntyre and Charles Taylor, maybe Walzer in. And Sandel was almost fighting in battle against Rawls and at one point declared victory. And then Kimlicka wrote his book, and Rawls never really responded to Sandel, never really engaged with it. And I think certainly that type of communitarianism has been associated with a metaphysical critique of Rawls, which really wasn't very successful, I don't think. My own feeling on this is that there's a type of accommodation between liberalism and communitarianism in which groups are seen as valuable, but not inescapable. And so there are groups in which people can choose to join and fail to join if they wish to. And then the debate disappears to some degree. That if you can have, you can see the value of groups, but you can also see the value of liberty. And so communitarianism as a distinct challenge to liberalism may have disappeared. But obviously behind your question is something else, a view that communitarianism is a strong, respectable position.
No, I understand that, especially in a Western intellectual sphere, political philosophy sphere, I understand that the communitarian critique of liberalism is not so successful. But in my impression, the question is still, valid question. I mean, it's a worthwhile question to ask, in the sense that, typical liberalism emphasizes too much, the individual values and so on. And that is done at the expense of, the sense of community and belonging and connection between individuals, which speak much of a lot of modern problems on many levels. In a sense, I sympathize with Silva's question, with Silva's comment that this kind of a theoretical reflection on nationalism may be connected to this type of questioning. Yeah.
Thank you. No, I agree. I agree with that. Thank you.
Okay.
Alyssa?
Thanks. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
What I'm thinking about right now connects with what I think you said earlier. If I can call you Joe, don't people call you Joe?
They do, and you may.
Thank you. I think you said everything runs on goodwill ultimately. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about that because that's very clearly true. I've been thinking about it in connection with my, America and the very serious threats to our democratic system, from, domestic and also international. And in the past 8 years in particular, I've been thinking about the extent to which the proper functioning of the legal system depends on personal integrity and commitment to the political values. And so anybody committed to liberal, especially a Rawlsian liberal outlook, and that's me, Kantian Rawlsian, thinks a bit, although I haven't done enough thinking, I hope you will, about what it takes in the way of social structures and practices to foster and nurture those sorts of character virtues, or at least the types of political conviction, and the types of integrity necessary so that enough of the people in the relevant social and political institutions, and political and legal in particular, will do their jobs properly, understanding what that means. And so fostering virtues of character requires us to think about family and education at all levels. It's very interesting to me to think about a topic of research that I never pursued, but considered pursuing when I was in my 20s living in Israel, which is the different types of education of Israeli children. I lived on a couple of different kibbutzim at different times during my years there, and one of them was just undergoing the transition away from collective child raising. And for the most part, the children who were raised in the collective arrangements on kibbutzim were very strongly nationalist, patriotic Israelis, very highly disciplined, generally admired in terms of their traits of character, but a particular set of traits. And so ultimately, these debates are surely fueled partly by different convictions about how children should be raised and what are the traits of character that are most to be valued. And also, I taught for Sandel a couple times at Harvard and disagreed with his interpretation of Rawls. But I like Sandel very much individually as a person, and he's Jewish. And I had a great deal of, and I babysat for him actually for a little while. And I, at one point I saw him carrying his son out, out from the building where he lectured. And I grew up with a strong sense that certain kinds of Jewish family structure supported by Jewish community and religious practice, I still feel very deeply in favor of them. But that's, I think it's very typical for people to think in a very sloppy way when they're making generalizations about groups. What's Jewish? It's all sorts of different things. I mean, people use the term Jewish to refer to a wide range of types of practice and attitude and religious belief and atheism and political commitment. And so what am I saying now? If you want to pursue this project, which is now ramifying, I think another fruitful line of inquiry would be different child raising practices and how they are supported by different religions and different social structures. And that would be one of the sources of the very strong emotions. I know there are strong emotions of many kinds, including, worry about losing jobs to immigrants. But so I guess I'm advocating pausing, stepping back, looking at the entire range of sources of some of the strongest emotions. Thanks.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So the place of emotions is part of this project, and the connection between ceremony and emotion is very important. And the attitude in our tradition against emotion, I think, has been responsible for a very narrow view. I hadn't thought of looking at child raising practices. The project is already expanding way out of control, so I have no idea if I can do that. But I just want to make a comment about the first thing about goodwill, because this came up for me really in my teaching when I first started teaching history of political philosophy. And I'd learned about the separation of powers and the checks and balances. And then I was teaching Hobbes, and Hobbes's argument that the only way of subduing a power is with a greater power. And so therefore there must be a greatest power in any, well, the sovereign must have the greatest power. There must be a sovereign. And I was very torn on this because I thought, well, on the one hand, haven't I learned about the separation of powers? So you can divide power between three different organizations with checks and balances. But on the other hand, there seems to be a sort of compelling logic to Hobbes's argument. So I thought in the end, the separation of powers is not a sort of game theory, logical separation of powers where or military separation of powers, where you have these literal forces, but the separation of powers just depends on everyone involved believing in the separation of powers, and believing that there are things they can't do, and believing that if they, this is outside the scope of what is proper for someone in my role to do, and deferring. So in some cases, not using the power that they have. And we saw that tested in the United States, that we came very close to a breakdown of the separation of powers, I think, but it restored itself, but it could have gone differently. So even there seems to be, just at the moment, hanging by a thread, a sufficient degree of goodwill to keep things going. But the Sandel thing is a sort of mystery to me, because as you know yourself, having taught on it, that Michael teaches that justice course. I don't know if he's still doing it, but the year I was there were 800 people enrolled on it, about another 200 auditing. So that's 1,000 people a year. He's been doing that for 30 years. That's 30,000 of the US elite have studied justice with Michael Sandel. You would think the country should be pretty just by now, but it doesn't seem to have worked out that way. So there's some barrier between learning and applying theories of justice, or maybe it's the wrong people in the wrong position.
Highly tempted to comment, but thank you very much.
I mean, can I go again? It's been good cause for reflection, this talk. It occurred to me that one of the difficulties with nationalism, advocating it as a political doctrine or political ideology that you don't discourage people from adopting, is that it doesn't have a worked out theory of citizenship, of how people fit into a society together, what the basis of your common commitment is going to be. It tends to rely on symbols and emotions and feelings, which are very difficult to kind of transmit, and can mean different things to different people within the same community. So I think that nationalism, if it's advocated outside the bounds of an acceptable theory of citizenship, I don't think we should embrace it. Whereas if you can get a theory of citizenship where some of these emotional ties and rituals can be fitted in, that seems to me to be more workable. But in terms of political theory, I think it's a question of how can nationalism be accommodated within the kind of strengths of the discipline, rather than the discipline kind of bowing to the apparent superior empirical presence and influence of nationalism. I think, these things go in tight, that for the moment, it seems, from India right through to the rest, to the UK and to the United States, nationalism seems to be on a rising wave. But it can so disappoint its advocates because they don't have a coherent basis for their own allegiance. And like the mobs that went into Congress, they all seem to have different views of what they were up to. I mean, you could see that in the clothes they were wearing and the symbols they were carrying with them. So, I'm with you in the sense that sovereign power should be used to try and bring some sort of order to this. But I think that I put a lot of emphasis on the division of power within that sovereign power as well. Anyway, those are some further thoughts.
So I don't want to give the impression that I'm defending nationalism. What I'm trying to do is understand its appeal and recapture that appeal in less noxious ways, but without being dogmatic about it. But I think you're right that a account of citizenship is important. What we seem to have is a national institution, or as you say, a rise of nationalism without an understanding of citizenship. And also your comments about the diversity of the protesters also brings to mind the debacle around Brexit again, which I keep coming back to. Because there, I mean, what Brexit shows is how much easier it is to be opposed to something than to be in favor of an alternative. And that you know, people had quite different ideas about what they were going to get out of it. And no one has got anything, actually, of the things they thought they were going to get from it. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say in response.
Ongoing work, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think in one of those Guardian columns I once wrote, a liberal's work is never done.
Vigilance all the time.
Yeah.
Denim, do you think it's what's 10:15 in China? 20:10 in China?
Well, quite late. Yeah.
Yeah, 10:20. Yes.
All right, you've earned your sleep, I think.
Yeah, it's all right. It's worth the the time, and it's a very good event. So I enjoy it very much. I don't mind staying up late. You know.
Are there any more questions? Then anybody want to? David Reedy, you've not said anything. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts going on in that head of yours.
Well, there is. I quite enjoyed the talk. I've been and the discussion, and a number of salient points that were floating in my head have been raised by others. But there's two things that are still lurking in the background. One, which is in the spirit of, you know, sometimes nationalism can be a positive force, whether it's anti-colonialist, self-determination, and so on, is related to that letter, the exchange of letters between Rawls and von Parijs, which I'm sure you're aware of, where regarding the unification of Europe, Rawls says, you know, he suspects that if it were to succeed, that the diverse peoples of Europe would come to regret it, and that the effort was essentially part of a global banking class interest, and he, I think, implies and has in mind that that's a sort of politically deracinating force. And so global capitalism has a sort of deracinating force and leaves us with a atomized heap ultimately, and that makes anything like democracy pretty untenable. And that links to the second question, which is that, you know, while everybody, of course, wants to accommodate diversity in modern nation states, all the empirical work, and I teach a fair bit of empirical work now in democratic theory, because I don't think you can do good democratic theory without being aware of it. But a lot of empirical work is quite clear that democracy presupposes a fair amount of consensus for it to be viable at all. And that consensus isn't simply, you know, we agree on science, basic facts of science, and so on. There's a normative consensus that extends into things like a sort of loose idea of a shared form of life, and so on. And I would want to anchor that in citizenship, as Howard has suggested and others have intimated. But if we put these things together, I'm drawn to the following thought, which is that if democracy is to survive in the world against the deracinating forces of global capitalism, some form of democratic civic nationalism has to be acceptable and integrated into the politics of mature democracies. And so I'm just wondering how you might react to that. And I suspect that's kind of what Miller and Walzer and others are on about.
So, yeah, very good. So I had forgotten about the Rawls van Parijs correspondence. I should definitely take a look at that. So I mean, David Miller argues for a shared national culture, and I suppose that can mean lots of different things. If it's a shared political culture, then that is inoffensive. If it's a sort of full-blooded national culture, then that feels too exclusive. So we need to work that out. And you know, the comments Andrew was making about multiculturalism fit in here, that what degree can we have multiculturalism where you have loyalty to everyone? So I just published a book with Avner Deshali called City of Equals. And there we're looking at what makes some cities feel equal. It's available open access. You can get it right now on the link should you wish to do that. I don't even make any money from it. So and one thing we found in the cities where we interviewed people, that people welcomed diversity. They wanted to visit they wanted to visit people that weren't like them. Some wanted to live near, some not so sure. But it was a very common theme in the interviews that people wanted to live in something that was culturally diverse. But at the same time, no doubt it's diverse within reason. So I don't think, for example, anyone would have said they wanted to live in a society where you can have different, it could be different types of polygamous relationships, for example, or yeah, they wouldn't want it meant to be able to have 5 wives just because that would be interesting and diverse. So it's diversity within a sort of relatively liberal frame, I suppose. So yeah, I think there's a balance to be got there. And I'm also distinct from some political philosophers in thinking there probably isn't solutions to much, that and things change, and we need to be much more dynamic and be prepared to try things out and change them and be satisfied for a while without thinking that we can come up with, you know, the 2 principles of justice or the constitution to end all constitutions or perpetual peace. I don't think any of these things are really realistic. I think we can be doing better and doing worse, and things that are working for a while may stop working for a while, and we need to try something else. So sort of very much more pragmatic and piecemeal than much we find in our tradition.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? So actually it's well, it's quite late here in Beijing, as Howard just mentioned, and yeah, so we have done this like for 1.5 hours, so I think it's about time to wrap it up. So thank you very much, Professor Wolff, for this wonderful talk, and I learned very much. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure our audiences feel the same way. And a few words about the series. So this series of political theories, it's called PKU-Cardiff Theories of Political Theories. It started by Professor Howard Williams and myself. I think it's like about 2 years ago, during the pandemic year, and we started to gather a group of political theorists, political philosophers from different countries to give talks on various topics. And it's also a way to bring together, you know, people from different cultural background, different social contexts, and talk about very you know, political theoretical issues. And I think it's been successful so far. And you know, many gratitude to our all of the guests like Professor Wolff today. So thank you very much. And yeah, how do you want to say a few?
Yeah, thank you for the excellent talk. It was great format. I think it was very enjoyable to have a long discussion session, and it's intriguing, isn't it, that the actual context of the talk is really not a lot to do with nationalism at all, is it? So, I think I'll reflect on that as we say goodbye to each other. Many, many thanks. It was
Well,
a
can I
very-
thank you all? Excellent comments. Great to see you and catch up. It's amazing to see you after all this time, and everyone else here. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Howard and Demin, for organizing. Okay.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.